right before the pandemic started. So now I'm going to talk about a project that I did this past November, and I've been thinking more and more about water, what it means to control water, and this is an aerial image of the wastewater treatment facility where I live. And in my town, we have a climate action commission where we are working to reduce our greenhouse gases and focus on climate justice. So Dave Runkle has been the laboratory supervisor for 37 years. He's in the middle picture. And the picture on the left is us going into intake where all our sewage comes in. And then the last picture is when we're in the lab where they are continuously testing water from different parts of the town to make sure it is okay. And so I learned a lot about where our sewage goes, how the solids are used for fertilizer, how there's different grades of fertilizer, and thinking about the disparities of access to clean water in low income and communities of color. Additionally, this is a fossil pit at a park near like an hour away from where I live. And this book, Timefulness by Bjorn Nerud, has also been really impactful in thinking about the vast amount of time that our planet has formed and thinking about how things that were living hundreds of millions of years ago have now become resources that we extract for use, but knowing that these are also finite. And so thinking about how the rhythms of our past could help inform our future. And so this ties into the forms that I made for the piece at Greenwich House Pottery, and also the piece that I'm going to show you on the next slide that came from a period of time around 600 million years ago, the Ediacarian period. And it's very like nerdy and specific time period, but I was interested in that most of the earth was covered in water and that there wasn't a huge predator-prey dynamic, but mostly things floated and kind of gained their nutrients around them. And then these are some fossils from that time period found in Afghanistan and Iran. So this is the project that I installed at DePaul University in November. And it was the first time I also worked with concrete as a material, concrete being like a material that consumes a lot of carbon and greenhouse gases in terms of the amount of water it uses in creating gravel. And I'll go into another book that was really inspirational in that. This was the first time that I also could do some video mapping where I could design the projection to fit something specifically versus being a rectangle or a square. And so wanting to kind of evoke something coming out of this landscape that we can create with our ability as humans. So this was the book Undermining by Lucy Lepard. I recommend any of her books. I really love her writing. And she lives in the Southwest. And so she's talking a lot about, what we are extracting from the earth and its impacts. So this is a gravel mine, but she goes into like uranium, looking also at like general, like land use in general. And so this is, I'll show you a couple images from what's on display now at Greenwich House Pottery. And I guess in a way I should say too that I don't think that like concrete is evil, because I think about the ability for it to make areas more accessible as you become older or you have issues with balance, or if you are in a wheelchair, like you wouldn't have the same accessibility if we had dirt roads or unpaved roads. And so I never think of something as like solely black or white, but that there's kind of this gray space that maybe is harder to describe, but the reality of how the world we live in. And so the video for this piece comes from rain going into a sewer, thinking about like infrastructure we have for collecting water and how it can be reused. And then in the space at the gallery, wanting to evoke the sense of a fissure in the floor that could connect to our past. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I got to working with raw clay. And a lot of this comes from my time in graduate school, which felt very much like a laboratory and a community to experiment. I had taken a class on installation art, an art history class on installation art, and we had learned a lot about land works from the 60s. And so I was thinking about artists who were working in a way that was less aggressive on the environment. And so Richard Long did this piece where he just walked back and forth to create a line by wearing away the grass. And then looking at these Nazca drawings that were large geoglyphs made in the soil, and they were made in a collective way where many people together would create incisions and remove pebbles. And I liked this one in particular as it felt very mycelial. And then I was thinking about my own footsteps themselves, what they were maybe insignificant by itself, but together cumulatively. And another book, Mi-Wan Kwan's One Place After Another, talking about site-specific art. And Mi-Wan Kwan and Philip Kaiser organized this exhibition in 2012 called Ends of the Earth Land Art to 1974, where they are kind of relooking at this genre that had often been talked about in this very romantic, heroic American male perspective, and bringing a more global and also including female artists. And so this piece by Alice Aycock was where she had mixed clay with water and poured them into these plywood grids. And then over the weeks, the clay hardened and dried and cracked, much like if you were to come upon dirt that had got rained upon outside. And these are some other artists that have been really influential. Phoebe Cummings, this piece in particular, where she had the plastic sort of containing the moisture and humidity of the clay. And Merrick Sekula creating this piece that was, the clay covered the floor of the gallery space, and the viewer was allowed to walk on it and contribute to the erosion and decay of the installation, the breakdown sort of connecting to our condition of being humans. And then these were experiments with building these outside, thinking about how some people will notice things, some people won't, and eventually it not necessarily matching the landscape of the campus, which itself was very fabricated. So boulders and prairie land, and the campus was covered in this Kentucky bluegrass, which required a lot of water. And I felt bad that facilities, someone else had to clean this up, like I would have cleaned, but it happened so quickly over a span of just a couple days. This book I read last year, Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds Change Our Minds by Merlin Sheldrake, and thinking about alternatives to our traditional funerary processes, that fungi can neutralize toxins in our body, they can digest cigarette butts, TNT, and how our culture has been shaped by these organisms. And those were really the primary organisms that inspired the first time I had built something with raw clay here. And having water or projection wash over a static form allowed it to be activated in a way. And this recording was of ocean waves where, as you stand, your feet might sink deeper and deeper into the sand. And there's sort of this somatic experience of knowing that when the wave leaves, another will come back. So wanting the museum space to be more of a site where reflection can take place. And this also stemming from Brian O'Doherty's writings. He had 3 essays on the white cube where he describes the gallery as being a spiritual space where we take on another role. We don't necessarily run around, but we speak softer in a polite manner. There aren't windows or clocks, so we don't necessarily know the time of day, and this being maybe akin to temples, or I think of Islamic temples in particularly, where the decoration is so ornate and detailed that you can sort of become lost. So it'll take usually many months to build up the parts for a project like this. And then as it's exhibited, it'll crack and different fissures will form. And at the end, the clay will be recycled. And this tying very much to Zen mandalas, and this idea of the process itself may be very laborious and very cared for and thoughtful, but to be able to let go of that, I think, is a powerful thing connected to all living things. So one last artist that was very influential was Charles Simmons, building his dwellings. These ideas of, like, for him, they were imaginary people, but creating with clay in our already built landscape and cracks and spaces. And then thinking also about mosses, this is a really great book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Gathering Moss, and thinking about how these organisms have also lived for many, like thousands of years before us. The peat moss that you can get at the store has been existing for thousands of years. And so just thinking about, I guess, these spans of time, which I have found to be really difficult to find tangible in just numbers. And these are some more examples of building outside in spaces, usually in concrete or asphalt, thinking about the ability of spores or seeds to travel and take root, and then allowing them also to be able to decay and break down outside with the elements, and bring attention to different parts of architecture. So as an educator, I have become increasingly interested in my own practice, as well as with my students, of working with local clays. So the college that I teach at, we have an organic farm that has a holistic approach to land stewardship, rooted in management processes that sustain the natural environment. So this is through sustainable agriculture, CSA, donating fresh produce to our local pantry, and offering youth programs. And so here, students are digging clay at the farm that we then brought back and they processed to throw with. And so this past January to April, I had the opportunity to participate in a residency at McColl Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the building is really interesting that the residency is in, because it was an old church and there was a fire in it in the 80s that burned everything except for the stone and brick interior. And so you can see a lot of the burn marks in it. And so when I got to Charlotte, I didn't have any connections, but on one of my runs, I passed by many, many construction sites. The amount of development there is really aggressive, and the gentrification there has been really problematic. But Charlotte's a really big banking city, which I learned while I was there. And so everything felt really brand new in a way that I hadn't experienced in a city before. But one of the construction managers was very welcoming, and he gave me buckets of clay to work with. And here's some images of processing it. So first I just picked out like all the big rocks, so added water, ran it through 2 size meshes, and then dried it out. And so I used some of this clay in an installation in the basement floor, where I was building around this drain pipe. And so this was also another experiment with the mapping to create something that was maybe more puddle-like or softer than maybe like a crack. And I was also able to experiment with making my own bricks, as this was an interest I was starting to have in reading more and more about brick plantations where enslaved people labored, producing a lot of the bricks for the buildings in the area. And while I was there, I was able to connect with Davidson College's archives. Davidson's a college that's about 30 minutes north of Charlotte. And coming across these articles where the bricks for the campus were being like bought from enslaved people working in plantations, and articles about the impressions of enslaved people's fingers like in the bricks as this really tangible connection to the material of clay, which can capture our fingerprints and history, but also like to thinking about where our buildings have come from, or the labor behind how they were made. So in the process of making these bricks, I didn't feel like it felt like, I didn't feel like I felt like I wanted the clay to stay there. It didn't feel like it was something that I wanted to bring with me. And so I started sprouting this pink mully grass, which is a seed that can do well in clay and sand, and then leaving this outside so that it would eventually sort of become a mound or decay and hopefully just grow into this very colorful grass form in the space there. So this last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about projects that I've worked on that aren't necessarily made from clay, but are very much connected to ideas that I'm thinking about. So this artist, Mika Rotenberg, is an Argentine-Israeli artist, and she works mostly in video and sculpture. And I think she does this really great way of questioning how objects and bodies can have so much difficulty in crossing borders, but that objects can cross borders so much more easily than people. So thinking about like how far different like consumers goods can travel. And then also thinking about just the volume of things that exist in our world and planned obsolescence. And I question these ideas of endless growth. So this was an installation called Reorienting, where I used plastic bags from big box stores. I would go collect their plastic bag like collection and then cut them into strips. And then I wove them into these nets that I tied, which had come from an inspiration of being in a residency in Iceland, where the rural town where it was located was mostly a fishing port, but the overfishing of cod and climate change had depleted their stocks, and it really impacted the economy of this town. Using turf grass and plastic lawn chairs, trying to create sort of this synthetic environment that was maybe both welcoming and kind of weird. At the time too, when I made this piece, China had just announced it was no longer taking the world's plastics, and also thinking about recycling plastics is tremendously difficult in that they have to be all the same material and they have to be clean. And then I guess as a practice too, like trying to reuse things that I've made into new pieces. So here I used those same bags, but displayed them in a mound and trying to have them be captured in their own way. And these are some large prints that I then of lichen and moss that are blown up really, really big. And I then drew back into them and using different text to speak to environmental pollution, environmental racism, and that lichen are a really good indicator of air pollution in environments because they absorb nutrients just through their bodies. Here's a fired ceramic piece called Even Out, which kind of evoked for me like a forest that I grew up around, parking ballards, basalt, suburban lawns. And then this was a really great piece from the New York Times on the Great American Lawn. I highly recommend it. learning about, grass being the most irrigated plant in the USA. And, most grasses here not being native, that colonists brought them for feeding livestock, and lawns very much coming from high social classes in Europe. Washington and Jefferson's lawns were obviously created through the exploitation of the labor of slaves. So I decided to work with turf grass more in these pieces. This was in the same exhibition that was in November at DePauw University, and also incorporating real plants into some of them to see how the timeless versus the changing. While I was at McCall, I also experimented with embroidering some of this turf grass. So I would tweeze out a pattern and then sort of stitch in with thread. And this piece is fairly new, so I'm still very much thinking through about it. And then I will end with, this is a book that I'm reading right now, The New Politics of the Handmade. And it's composed of a series of essays from different authors who are examining ideas of craft, labor, and sort of sovereignty between all these things, and aesthetics. And I'm really enjoying it right now, so I recommend that. And I welcome any questions.
All right, maybe I'll go ahead and share the install video.
Oh, great, yeah.
But keep thinking of your questions, everyone. And if anyone has any pressing question, feel free to ask it now. But I'll go ahead and show the install video. All right, now, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. I think, so far we've got one item in the chat, and it's from Lily, who says, thanks so much, brilliant and fascinating.
I have a question. Your work is so intricate and beautiful and detailed. It must take you hours and hours to make each piece and to assemble it. I'm curious about how long that does take. And then how do you feel about it in the end? You're recycling it.
Hi. So the amount of time it takes depends on sort of the scale of the project. The sort of square piece that was 9 feet by 9 feet, that probably took about like 6 months to build all the parts, and then I'll store them in like salad bins that I have to keep the pieces soft. And then when I'm on site, it will probably take a few days to install. And the piece at Greenwich House went much quicker because the scale of it was sort of more slender. I really appreciate the ability to be able to recycle them. In a way, it feels maybe less burdensome to me. That I don't know. I think sometimes I can feel overwhelmed if I have I've been collecting so much stuff that I find it easier to purge my own work than work that I've been able to collect from friends or other artists. And so I think it's this maybe like being human, there's so much joy that I draw from by having objects that are made by others around me. But within my own work, I think I feel sort of like, I guess I know that I can reuse it and it'll become something new again. So it kind of just has another life in a way. But I think if you had asked me that when I was younger, I probably wouldn't have said the same thing. I think I would have wanted to keep everything that I had made. Yeah.
Thanks for adding so many books to our reading lists. I don't know where you find the time to make things or to eat. Sounds like you're a voracious reader.
Yeah, I think maybe the past 2 years have given me a lot of time to read more too. But I think also I have to balance like maybe the nonfiction also with fiction books. Like I like to get lost in like a good science fiction where it's sort of like showing us possible futures or pasts, along with things that are maybe, I don't know, rooted in reality more.
Mm-hmm. Was your background before ceramics and the natural sciences, or how did that evolve in your practice?
I guess I've always been interested in like when just looking outside what's around us and just being curious or having questions about it. I guess I took like a lot of science classes, but I didn't ever study it in depth. My husband, Mitch, though, he's probably also a huge inspiration as he studied biology. And I feel like when I have questions about something, I'll be like, why is this like this? And he'll be able to kind of like generate more curiosity or questions about things like that. But yeah, I think maybe just because as humans, we have interests in different facets of our life. I find that comes into it.
I found your work very, very powerful and moving. But could you talk a little bit about the piece at Greenwich House in terms of, I'm assuming the objects in the piece are derivative from some of the books that you've referenced in your talk, but I'd be curious as to your thinking about how you actually, what the sequence of placing things were in that framework, and kind of what your thought process was, and maybe a little amplification as to what each of those objects may in fact represent.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess like I feel like the most recent like book that had influenced that was The Timefulness by Bjorn Nerud, where she's talking about these different like phases of our planets that our planet has like gone through. And since there are no photographs or like actual like records of what these time periods look like, a lot of them are based off of the fossil records that we can find, and then also like artistic renderings of these periods. So that image I had shown from the Ediacaran period was from the Smithsonian's sort of diorama. And so a lot of these I was based just looking at different fossils from that time period, but not necessarily knowing the scale of them. So they all kind of became scalable to this installation. And so some of the forms that were maybe more round and patty-like with like crimped edges, those might have been actually like quite massive. But I shrunk all of them down in terms of, I guess, for the rhythm of the feel of them. I felt like if I made forms that were too large, they might create these gaps in the movement of the texture. And when I'm sort of, I guess, sequencing or placing these pieces, I'm thinking a lot about the shadows and highlights that will come about from them. And I talk about that in terms of maybe how we look at drawing, because I think of the way that the light's going to play. Other ones maybe reference more of like brachiopods. And although brachiopods weren't necessarily living at that time, a lot of organisms that could have been precursors to those were existing at this period, where they are bivalves, like they have a top and a bottom shell. And so there's some forms that have these sort of spaces that look like they could open up, but that they were rooted into the ground, and their top shell and bottom shell are slightly different. And other ones, like I think about what exists in our oceans now, and the long connections between things like tube worms. And so I guess like I don't tie myself to making them be exactly like forms, and that's the same with the fungi or lichen, but allow them to sort of be a starting point as a reference point for them.
Do the forms evolve in terms of how you're putting this, assembling a piece, or do you have an idea when you first start out the kind of forms that you want to incorporate into?
That's a good question. I think it's a mix. I think sometimes I'll have something very much in mind that I want to build, and then other times it's in the process of working with the clay. I'll come upon a form that I didn't even think about, but just in the way of manipulating or trying a different way of moving the clay, or a different gesture creates a form that then I like and I'll continue with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, for the outdoor installations that you've done in the past, Rachel, how you select those locations. You know, do you go out looking for something specific, or, you know, it seems like you're really a runner and you do a lot of running. Do you kind of notice locations while you're out on a run and kind of think of something to do? I'm just kind of curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, I would say it's a mix. Like it might be, I'll be in a new place and I might run or walk and then find a spot. And I guess a lot of times I'm just drawn to like built landscape, not necessarily a forest or like something that already itself is kind of has things living and growing. And I guess like sometimes I'm nervous because if there's other people around, or like you know, the ideas of public and private property, like trespassing and things like that. So sometimes it kind of depends on the amount of traffic in an area too. And I always think of, there was this video Charles Simmons had on his site a while ago, where he's like, he has a backpack and he's building, I think in Brooklyn somewhere, and like all these people are kind of gathering around him, and like kids are gathering around him, and he's like able to keep working. And I think there was even like a car burning in the background. And but I feel like I'm much more nervous about like, I don't know, being told to like stop what I'm doing. So I feel like the site depends on how I feel about all those factors together.
Yeah, that was gonna be part of my question. How often kind of you get approval in advance, or like how often these are kind of just like guerrilla installations where you identify a spot and put it up and hope that it lasts, but maybe someone cleans it up or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if it's like I guess if it's a formal exhibition, then I have permission. But if it's not, then yeah, I've done it before. I guess I was experimenting with all sorts of places, and I did it when I was at the beach once, and I just kind of sat nearby to see what might happen. And someone picked it up and put it in their pocket, and I was like, oh, this is so strange. It's just gonna like crumble. So I guess in a way, it's kind of an observation of just how different situations or scenarios might work out.
Okay, well, if no one else has another question, I'm gonna jump on with my other question. I was wondering how, maybe this is just kind of an oddball question, but I was wondering if there's any overlap between kind of your mental state when you're on a run and your mental state when you're kind of preparing work for an installation. I used to be a runner, and I'm just kind of like thinking of that place you can get when you're running where you're just kind of, you know, you could call it like being in flow the same way that if you're building a sculpture, you could get in that state of flow. And I was wondering if there's any connection there or not really anything important.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a connection there. And I think that also connects to like why so many of us are drawn to working with our hands. Like there's something that can be very calming about it. And that I think it's like a really human thing that, especially with clay, there's such a directness when you are touching the material and sort of it being a material that can be transformed into anything that like we desire. It can mimic other materials really well too. And yeah, I would say that like running I do find to be a meditation, and this process of working I also find to be meditative. And I also find that this process of working is also like work too. There's times when I'm like, I know I need to like get to a certain point to meet like an installation or something like that. But at this point, like finding like I guess ways to take care of myself physically in the process of the actual installation, because oftentimes it's on the ground. And yeah, I think I think they're very similar, because sometimes I'm running and it feels like it's a lot of work, and then sometimes it's like really liberating. Yeah, so.
Does anyone else have any questions? I don't have anything else in the chat to read out, so no, don't be shy if anyone else has any other questions. Okay, well then I think we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Rachel. The installation is fantastic, and wonderful artist talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. And you have the recording. I missed a few minutes at the beginning, but I'll be posting the recording shortly too. So if you missed anything, you can go back and listen.
And Rachel also brought a few pieces from an exhibition in Philadelphia that we have now in the gallery, right? Small
Yes.
fired pieces. One is porcelain. They're both porcelain, but one is gold lustered.
Yes, correct.
They're beauties. Fired beauties. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.